In this video, we're going to talk about classes and objects in Python. And the first thing I'd like to say at the very beginning is try not to get too intimidated by the mystique of object-oriented programming and the terminology of object-oriented programming. I think in many situations, I think people have a tendency to think that this is too hard, this is beyond what I can understand, this is for real programmers, and this is not for me. So I'm going to try to focus on the mechanics of how we create classes and objects in Python. I'm also going to try to explain some of the reasons why you might want to use classes and objects in certain situations, and why in other situations you're probably just better off using variables and functions. So I'm going to try to give you at least a little bit of a framework of when using Python classes and objects might make sense. Now, first of all, let's dive into the mechanics of actually creating a class and objects in Python. So the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to use the class keyword, and then we're going to give the class some name. So you can see here, here's the class keyword. I've chosen a name, so this can be whatever name you've chosen. And by convention, the naming should follow camel case with each of the words being capitalized. So here I've capitalized the N and the D in network device, and then I can just terminate this with a colon. Now inside the class, the very first thing that you frequently do is you actually define the initialization method. And the initialization method will look something like the following. So notice we say def. We then specify double underscore init double underscore. Double underscore methods, sometimes known as dunder methods, also sometimes referred to as magic methods in Python. They have special meaning and special significance. The init method in the context of classes is going to be a method that gets called to initialize an object. And I'm going to explain that in a little bit more detail as we go through these videos. But basically, this is a method that's called early on in the object creation process that's used to initialize the object. And I'll explain the self variable also here in a few minutes. Now, when you define a class, what you're doing is basically making a blueprint for how you create things of this type. So we're creating a blueprint here for how we create things of the network device type. And that also includes what can things of this type do. And the doing part is associated with methods. And we've already created one method, this double underscore init method. And if you look at the syntax of that, you can see the syntax is very similar to the syntax of functions in Python. So we have a def, which is the same syntax we'd use for function creation. We give it a name, so here our name is a special name, the double underscore init double underscore, and then we pass in a set of arguments, and here we're just passing in one argument, this argument self, which, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, I'm going to explain in more detail as we go through these videos. Now this is all just a blueprint for how we create objects of this type network device, but we actually haven't created any objects of that type yet. So how do we create objects of that type? We would just say give some variable name, and then we would call the class. So notice here I call the class network device, and I put parentheses after it to indicate that I'm calling that class. So here I'm creating an object, and I'm giving it a variable named router1, but I'm creating an object of type network device. So at the end of this, I would have created two objects, one named router1, one named router2, and they're both of the type network device. And if we go ahead and import the Python debugger, I'm actually going to use IPDB, which gives better syntax highlighting, but it's essentially the Python debugger, and then I'm going to put a breakpoint. We can see what this behavior looks like. Go ahead and execute that. And then I'll just list all the lines of my code. That's just a long listing. And you can see I'm at line 10. if I execute, next statement is just in, which is going to execute that line 10. We can see at this point I've created an instance. Router 1 is an instance of the network device class. It's this network device object. If I go ahead and execute one more line, you can see I now have a second variable named router 2. It is also an instance of this network device class. So we have two parts here. We have the blueprint for how the class behaves. This is all inside our class statement, so all indented underneath the class statement after we indicate its name. And then we have the actual process where we create objects of that type, and I'm showing you down here where we do router 1 equals network device, and we actually call the class. So we're creating instances using that blueprint.